They gave me a yellow tag, not a red one, not a green one, yellow, the color they used for journalists, diplomats, and people the Calveth Conclave considered too soft to be worth watching. The registration officer, a tall, four-armed creature with gray-plated skin and small black eyes, had looked at my file for exactly 3 seconds before slapping the tag onto the table in front of me. He did not ask my name. He did not ask my background. He scanned the chip in my wrist, saw no registered combat augmentations, no military service record, no documented conflict history, and that was enough. I was yellow, I was fragile, I was done. I picked up the tag without a word and clipped it to the outside of my collar where everyone could see it. My name is Dr. Mara Voss. I am 31 years old. I have spent the last 9 years working as a xenobiologist and field medic for the Interstellar Medical Corps, which means I have lived in tents, craters, pressurized cargo pods, and once memorably, inside the lower digestive chamber of a deceased whole-wrath whale, while performing an internal tissue survey. I have worked in 6 different star systems, on 14 different worlds, under conditions that would make most people rethink their career choices entirely. I have treated species that do not have names in any human language. I have performed surgery with instruments I built from whatever happened to be nearby. I have diagnosed conditions that the medical database listed as universally fatal, and I have walked patients out of those conditions through nothing more than careful observation and stubborn refusal to accept the obvious answer. None of that was on my combat record, because I do not have a combat record. The Calveth Conclave had been running for over 200 years. Every 30 years, the major spacefaring species gathered on the neutral station of Keldor Prime to compete in what the official documents called a demonstration of species capability. Everyone else called it the arena. It was not technically a war. No one technically died, because the medical rules required that combatants be rendered incapacitated rather than permanently harmed. But it was close enough to the real thing that species took it extremely seriously. Treaty rights, trade agreements, territorial claims, resource access across 6 star systems, all of it was tied in some formal or informal way to the outcome of the conclave. A species that consistently won earned influence. A species that consistently lost was quietly shuffled to the edges of galactic politics. Humanity had been invited for the first time. That was considered a great honor by the conclave's senior members, which meant it was considered deeply suspicious by every diplomat on our team. We were new. We were unknown. We were interesting in the way that small, unfamiliar animals are interesting, observed from a cautious distance until someone figures out whether they bite. Commander Glenn Hartley was our registered combatant. He was a decorated military officer with 20 years of active service, 3 commendations for close quarters operations, and a physical profile that the conclave's intake scanner had rated in the 94th percentile for combat potential among all registered species. He was also, as of 6 hours before the arena was scheduled to open, lying unconscious in the medical bay with a compound toxin moving through his nervous system that our medics had never seen before. It had been introduced through his water supply. The investigation would take days. The conclave's rules were simple. If a registered combatant could not compete by the time the arena sealed, the team had 2 options. They could forfeit and accept the diplomatic consequences, or they could submit a replacement from within their registered delegation. Our delegation consisted of Glenn, our 2 diplomats, a man named Colin Price and a woman named Laura Sutton, a communications officer named Derek, Hale, and me. Colin and Laura were not physically capable of arena competition, and both knew it. Derek had run a half marathon once and had never let any of us forget it, but the conclave's physical requirements would have finished him in the first round. That left one person. I was aware that every person in the room was looking at me with the specific expression of people who wanted to ask a question but were hoping someone else would ask it first. I saved them the trouble. I said that I would go. Laura made a sound that was not quite a word. Colin started to speak and then stopped. Derek looked at the floor. I looked at the conclave's duty officer, a lean creature called an Even with translucent skin and 4 rows of small flat teeth, who had come to deliver the official notice of forfeiture deadline. I told the Even that I was submitting myself as a replacement combatant under Conclave Rule 14, which allowed any registered delegation member to compete regardless of individual classification. The Even looked at my yellow tag, then at me, then back at the yellow tag. It pulled up a data slate, reviewed the rule, and confirmed that I was correct. The rule did not specify that the replacement had to hold a combat designation. It specified only that the replacement had to be a member of the registered delegation and had to be physically present. I was both of those things. They even stamped my tag with the arena entry code, the expression on its face. To the extent I could read even facial expressions, and I had spent 11 months on a research post alongside 3 of them, so I could read them reasonably well, was not concerned. It was something closer to amusement. That was fine. Amusement was fine. I had worked in places where the first reaction to a human doctor showing up was amusement. I had learned over time that amusement was a very useful thing to leave people with. It meant they stopped paying close attention. The arena gates were sealed before dawn. I stood in the long gray corridor that led from the holding area to the main floor and listened to the sound of the locking mechanism engaging. It was a heavy, decisive sound like a full stop at the end of a sentence, several tons of reinforced alloy settling into place. No one was getting in or out until the conclave's adjudication panel decided the session was complete. I checked my med kit. It was a standard core field kit, rated for multi-species emergency response. The conclave rules allowed non-lethal personal equipment. A medkit qualified. I had gone through it the night before, cataloging everything, and I had added 3 items from the general supply locker that no one had thought to restrict because no one had thought to ask why a non-combatant might want them. The corridor was cold. My shoulder ached slightly from the physical intake examination the day before. I had not slept more than 3 hours, but 3 hours was normal for me in field conditions, and I had long since made peace with the fact that my body ran on less sleep than the recommended amount, and more coffee than the recommended amount, and I had no intention of changing either of those things. From beyond the arena doors I could hear the crowd, thousands of beings from across 6-star systems, all of them here to watch the strong demonstrate their strength. The noise was layered and strange. Different species produced sound at different frequencies, and the combined effect was something between music and weather. I thought about Glenn, in the medical bay. I thought about the toxin in his system, and the fact that whoever had put it there had done so deliberately, had planned it carefully, had chosen the night before the arena sealed, so there would not be enough time for us to adapt. That person had made a calculation about humans. They had decided that without our fighter, we would fold. They had looked at our delegation and seen a doctor with a yellow tag and decided we were done. I clipped the yellow tag back to the outside of my collar, where the lights from the arena floor would catch it clearly when I walked out. Then the doors opened. The arena was enormous. The floor was pale gray composite, smooth and clean, stretching out in a circle roughly 80 meters across. The walls rose up around it in steep tiers, packed with spectators. Above the crowd, enormous display screens showed feeds from multiple angles, and along the top tier, the conclave's adjudication panel sat behind a curved glass barrier with their data slates and their official expressions and their absolute certainty about how this was going to go. My first opponent was already on the floor. His name, according to the data I had pulled the night before, was Hrock-Zahn. He was a Drath warrior, a species from a high-gravity world, which meant that what looked like a stocky, heavy-limbed creature to most observers was, in actual mechanical terms, a system built to operate under forces that would have crushed a human flat. He stood roughly 3 meters tall, with a wide chest, 6 limbs arranged in 2 arms and 4 legs, and a hide that ranged in color from dark green to near black. He had won his last 14 consecutive bouts. He had never, according to the record, gone to a second round. He looked at me across the pale gray floor and I watched something move through his expression. Not respect, not wariness. Something simpler and more instinctive. The expression of a creature that has just noticed something it does not understand and is filing that fact away for later, when it turns out not to matter. I had seen that expression before. I knew exactly what to do with it. I walked to the center of the floor, kept my hands loose at my sides, and I waited. The crowd noise shifted, settled. Someone in the upper tiers made a sound that I had learned to recognize across several species as laughter. I did not look up. Hrock-Zahn moved first. He came fast, faster than something his size had any business moving, and I did what I always do when something large and fast comes directly at me. I moved sideways, not backwards. Backwards is what people expect. Sideways puts you outside the line of force, in the space where the attacker's momentum has already committed. 3 years ago, on a research post in the Marin Belt, a Holrath ground runner had charged me during a field survey. I had stepped sideways then too. The principle is the same regardless of the size of the thing doing the charging. Hrock-Zahn corrected his angle and came again. I moved again. Same direction, same distance. I was not trying to hurt him yet, I was watching. His gait had a particular rhythm, the way his weight shifted between his 4 lower limbs, the way his left front arm dropped slightly lower than his right when he wound up for a strike. The positioning of the lateral ridge that ran along the upper section of his thorax. That ridge. I had read about that ridge. I had read about it not in a combat manual but in a xenoanatomy study published 6 years ago by a Drath researcher who had documented a previously unknown nerve cluster located just below it. A cluster so densely packed with signaling fiber that sharp mechanical pressure to the area caused full-body neural disruption lasting between 8 and 40 seconds, depending on the individual. The study had been published in a small medical journal. It was not in any combat database. There was no reason a fighter would have read it. There was every reason a xenobiologist would have. The third time Roxanne came at me, I did not step sideways. I stepped in, moved under his left arm as it came down, and drove the heel of my right hand into the lateral ridge with every gram of force my body could produce. At that angle, the effect was immediate. Every muscle in Roxanne's body locked simultaneously. He went down hard, all 3 meters of him, hitting the arena floor with a sound that rolled through the entire space like a struck bell. He was not unconscious. His eyes were open and aware. He simply could not move, not a single voluntary muscle. The neural disruption had done exactly what the study had described. He lay still. The arena was completely silent. I stood over him and waited the required 5 count for the adjudication panel to register an incapacitation. Then I stepped back, walked to the edge of the floor, and sat down on the low barrier there to wait for the ruling. My hand hurt from the impact. I flexed it twice, confirmed nothing was broken, and left it at that. The silence in the arena lasted a long time. Up in the adjudication tier, 3 officials were consulting in urgent quiet tones over a data slate. On the large display screens, the feed from the floor camera showed my yellow tag in close-up, bright and clear against the collar of my standard corps uniform. On the opposite side of the floor, 2 Drath delegation attendants were approaching Roxanne carefully, as though they were not entirely certain he was safe to approach. He was. He would be fully mobile within the hour. That was what the study had said. The disruption was complete and temporary. The ruling came through 2 minutes later. Incapacitation confirmed. Bout awarded to the human delegation. Someone in the crowd made a noise. Then someone else. Then a large section of the upper tiers erupted into something I could not classify as either approval or disapproval. It was something more unsettled than either. The sound of a very large audience encountering something it had not prepared. In the corridor walking back from the floor, I passed a young even medic who had been stationed near the arena entrance. He was staring at me with wide eyes. His skin, translucent like all Ivan, had gone a shade paler. I asked him if he had any spare analgesic gel for my hand. He reached into his kit without a word and handed me a tube. I thanked him and walked on. Behind me, I heard him say something to his colleague in Even. My Even was not fluent, but I caught the last word clearly enough. It was the word they used for things that did not fit into existing categories. I decided to take that as a compliment. In the medical bay, Glenn was still unconscious. I sat with him for a while, watching the monitors. The toxin was metabolizing slowly but steadily. He would be fine, given enough time. Someone had put something in his water supply with enough knowledge to do it precisely, cleanly, without leaving traces that our equipment had been expecting to find. That required a specific kind of knowledge. Medical knowledge. Someone had used medicine to remove our fighter. I had used medicine to put down theirs. I looked at my yellow tag. I thought about tomorrow. There were 8 more bouts scheduled before the finals. I had 2 days. My shoulder was fine. My hand would be fine by morning. I had a medkit, a working knowledge of xenoanatomy across 23 species, and the complete and total underestimation of every single being in this station. I have worked in worse conditions. I set an alarm for 4 hours, lay down on the bunk in the holding pen, and went to sleep. The conclave's bracket updated at midnight. My next opponent was listed as Rethvi, a Vec sharpshooter rated in the top 3 of his class. I read his file in the dark on my data slate, the light catching the yellow of my tag, and I started thinking about how the Vec inner ear processes particulate scatter. It was going to be a productive morning. There is a thing that happens in field medicine when you are working in a bad situation, and you know you are working in a bad situation, and you decide to work through it anyway. Your focus narrows, not in a bad way, in the way that a lens narrows when you adjust it. Everything outside the frame goes soft, and everything inside it becomes very, very clear. Your hands stop shaking not because you force them to, but because there is simply no room in the available processing space for the shaking. You are too busy solving the problem in front of you. I have always found that thing useful. The second bout was in the morning session. Rethvi stood across the floor from me and did not look amused. He looked careful. He had watched the footage of the previous bout, presumably. because every registered competitor received access to bout recordings as part of the standard preparation package. He knew I was not a fighter. He also knew that Roxanne had been taken down in under 4 minutes by a human with a yellow tag and a medkit, and that information had clearly adjusted his approach. He was positioned at distance. The Vec preferred range. They were extraordinarily precise at it. Their crystalline bolt weapons were rated for accuracy at up to 300 meters in standard atmosphere, and Rethvi had a tournament average accuracy rating of 91%. He did not need to come anywhere near me. The Conclave rules allowed personal equipment that was non-lethal and had been disclosed at registration. My medkit was registered. Its contents were listed. No one had flagged any item in it as prohibited, because no one had thought to imagine what a field medic might do with items that were individually routine and collectively something else entirely. Inside the kit, among other things, I had a particulate dispersal canister. It was standard equipment for any multi-species medical response, designed to distribute airborne analgesic compound in enclosed spaces during mass casualty events. It produced a very fine aerosol cloud, dense, persistent, excellent at filling a space. Vec echolocation, the system by which they tracked fast-moving objects at range with the precision their bolt weapons required, worked through a set of highly sensitive receptor organs located in the upper cranial ridge. Those receptors were extraordinarily good in clean air. They were significantly less effective when the air between the sender and the target was full of fine particulate matter. The scatter disrupted the return signal. The Vec word for this phenomenon, which I had encountered in a comparative sensory biology paper published 4 years ago, translated roughly as white noise blindness. I deployed the canister at the start of the bout. The cloud spread across roughly a third of the arena floor in under 20 seconds. Rethvi's first 3 shots went wide by margins that were, for a marksman of his caliber, essentially impossible. He recalibrated, repositioned, attempted to fire around the edge of the cloud. I moved with the cloud's edge. He could not pin a firing solution long enough to compensate. I waited until he had closed to a distance where his advantage was reduced to nearly nothing, and his frustration had shifted his positioning to something less careful. Then I crossed the distance between us at a flat run and ended the bout the same way I had ended the first one, though with a different anatomical target, because the Vec do not have a lateral thoracic nerve cluster. They have something better, from my perspective. They have a pressure point behind the lower jaw that causes full sensory overload if compressed at the correct angle with sufficient force. I had very sufficient force. The crowd reacted differently to the second bout. The amusement was gone. The silence was back. But it was a different kind of silence. Thicker, more careful. When I walked off the floor with my medkit on my shoulder, the conclave official who had been processing bout results at the side barrier did not look at my tag. He looked at my face, for a long time, as if he was trying to find something there that would explain what he had just watched. I smiled at him politely and went to find more analgesic gel. In the holding area after the second bout, one of the other competitors' support staff, a short, brown-furred creature I had not yet encountered in any of my xenobiology rotations, slid a food packet through the bars of my pen and walked away. Before I could say anything, I looked at the packet. It was a standard conclave provision ration, sealed and safe for human consumption. There was no note. I ate it. It was better than the Corefield rations I had been surviving on. The bracket updated again mid-afternoon. 6 competitors had been eliminated in the morning session. The remaining field was posted on the display boards throughout the holding complex, and I stood in front of one of those boards for a long time, looking at the name that had been placed across the bracket from me in the upcoming round. Velsorn. I knew that name. I had made it my business to know every name in the bracket before the arena sealed, but Velsorn was one that required more than a file review. He was a Kethmaran, a species that had evolved as coordinated pack hunters on a world with 22-hour nights and a temperature up to range that would have been hostile to most of the life forms currently in this station. The Kethmaran were fast, highly intelligent, and possessed a paralytic delivery mechanism in their lower jaw that was, according to every medical reference I had found, extremely difficult to counter once initiated. They were also the species that had produced the most consecutive arena victories in conclave history. Velsorn's record was 41 bouts, no losses. He had not competed in 6 years because, according to the notes I had found in the historical records, 4 species had quietly and informally agreed to stop scheduling bouts against him after his last match. Not because of rule violations, simply because there did not seem to be much point. I went back to my pen, sat down on the bunk, and opened my xenobiology references to everything filed under Kethmaran anatomy. I did not sleep that night, but I was not wasting the hours. Not even close. The third bout was the one the crowd had come to see. I could feel it when I walked out onto the floor. The atmosphere in the arena was different. The noise level was higher. But more than that, the texture of the crowd's attention had changed. They were not watching me the way they had watched me in the first two bouts, with that mixture of confusion and entertainment. They were watching me the way they watch something they are genuinely uncertain about, something that has earned a small amount of their respect and a large amount of their wariness. Velsorn was already on the floor when I entered. He was roughly my height, which surprised people who expected something larger. The Kethmaran were lean and fast rather than heavy and strong. He was covered in short, dark fur, with limbs that moved with the specific quality of things that have been moving quickly for so long that quick has become their resting state. His eyes were large, adapted for low-light hunting, and they found me the moment I came through the door. He watched me walk to the center of the floor. I watched him back. The night before, he had sent a message to my holding pen through one of the conclave communication relays. It had been brief. It said, "I will make it quick." I had sent one back. It said, "I know." I had meant it as information, not as bravado. I had spent the entire night working out exactly how quickly the Kethmaran paralytic mechanism needed to recharge between deployments, and the answer, buried in a veterinary biology study from a research post that had kept several Kethmaran specimens in controlled study, was between 40 and 60 seconds. During that window, the delivery mechanism was effectively inert. During that window, Velsorn was something closer to manageable. The challenge was surviving the first deployment attempt long enough to reach the window. He came at me faster than either of my previous opponents, and with considerably more intelligence. He did not commit fully on the first pass. He was testing me, reading my movement patterns, logging information the same way I was. Two hunters, measuring each other across a pale gray floor. He was better at this than I was. He had been doing it for decades. I knew that, and I factored it into my approach. His first real strike caught my shoulder before I could clear the angle. Not the paralytic, a standard impact strike, fast and precise. I absorbed it, moved with it rather than against it, and checked the shoulder. Not broken. Functional, painful, but pain was data, and data was useful. I now knew his reach, his preferred striking angle, and the exact gap between initiation and impact. He watched me check the shoulder. The expression on his face shifted. He had hit me, and I had not reacted the way he expected. I had reacted the way someone reacts when they are taking notes. He hesitated. That was the moment. I did not try to match his speed. I did not try to go through him. I went to his left side, the side of the old injury I had spotted in his gait during his warm-up. A healed fracture. In the lower left limb, compensated for so long it had become unconscious, but still there in the slight micro-delay in his leftward pivot. I worked the left side. Not hard strikes. Precisely placed pressure, repeated, forcing his weight to compensate, forcing his center of balance to shift, opening the lateral angle of his core. He recalibrated faster than I expected. He was remarkable. But the leg was real, and the compensation was real, and after 40 seconds of that kind of pressure, his positioning was 3 degrees less optimal than it had been when we started. 3 degrees was enough. I had timed the exchange carefully. I was at approximately 42 seconds from his last deployment attempt, far enough into the recharge window to proceed, when I drove past his guard at the opened angle and delivered the kind of blunt, focused strike to the base of his skull that the veterinary study had described as the Kethmaran pressure response point. Not harmful, not dangerous, simply overwhelming to a specific cluster of pressure-sensitive nerve endings that, when overloaded, triggered a brief and involuntary full-body shutdown response. Velsorn went down. The arena did not make a sound. He was conscious immediately, lying on the floor, looking up at me with those large dark eyes. I could see him processing. Not the defeat, the method of it. He was a hunter. He was used to being outthought, in the abstract as a concept. But in 41 bouts, no one had ever actually done it to him on a floor. I crouched down beside him and held out the tube of analgesic gel the young Ivan medic had given me. I still had most of it left. He looked at the tube. He looked at me. His eyes moved to my yellow tag. I told him that the compound inside was compatible with Kethmaran biology. I had checked before offering it. He would find it useful for the shoulder. I had noticed the tension in his right shoulder throughout the bout, and I suspected the root cause was an older injury than the leg, less obvious, more consistently irritating. He took the tube. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at me again, and the expression on his face was something I did not have a word for in any language I spoke. but I recognized the quality of it. It was the expression of a being that has encountered something that has changed the shape of a belief they have held for a very long time. The adjudication ruling came through. Bout awarded, I stood up, straightened my tag, and walked off the floor. Behind me, the crowd finally broke its silence. And this time, whatever they were making of what they had seen, the sound was different from anything that had come before. That evening, back in the holding pen, Colin came down from the delegation quarters with a look on his face that I had learned to associate with news that was either very good or very complicated. It turned out to be both. Commander Glenn Hartley's toxin screen had come back with a partial chemical signature. Our delegation's medical officer, a careful and methodical man named Peter Crane, had matched the signature to a compound that was not in any open medical database. It was in one restricted database, used exclusively by Conclave licensed medical practitioners. Someone with accredited medical clearance at the Conclave level had synthesized and introduced that compound. This was not a random act. This was not opportunistic sabotage. Someone with specific access, specific knowledge, and a specific reason for wanting us out of this competition had done this deliberately, with planning and precision. I sat with that information for a while. Then I asked Colin to get me access to the Conclave's registered competitor medical personnel list. He asked why. I told him that I wanted to know who on that list had the right combination of knowledge to produce that compound, the access to introduce it without triggering the monitoring systems, and a professional reason for understanding exactly which human physiology point that compound would target most effectively. Colin looked at me for a moment and then went to get the list. I spent the rest of the evening reading it. Outside my pen, the holding complex was quiet. The bracket had updated again. The semi-final field was down to 4 competitors, and I was one of them. The display board at the end of the corridor showed my name beside my yellow tag classification, listed in the same column as 3 beings who had spent their entire adult lives training for exactly this kind of competition. I read the personnel list until I found the name I was looking for. Then I folded the data slate, set it aside, and stared at the ceiling for a while. Not in defeat, not in uncertainty. In the way that I stare at ceilings when I have found something I needed to find and the finding of it has made the path forward both clearer and considerably more complicated. There was someone inside this conclave structure who had tried to end our participation before it began. That same person was still here, still watching, and still had access to things that I did not. The arena had been sealed before dawn, but not everything dangerous was in the arena. I put the data slate in my kit, next to the medkit, and set my alarm. There were 2 more bouts to win. Then there was a much larger problem to address. One thing at a time, though. Field medicine had taught me that you treat the most immediate crisis first. I had a semi-final in the morning. I went to sleep. The night before the semi-final, someone went through my medkit. I knew it the moment I picked it up the next morning, because I always arrange the interior with the same system I use in field conditions. Each item in a specific position that I can navigate by touch, in complete darkness. 12 years of fieldwork builds habits that become instincts, and my instincts told me the moment my hand entered the outer pocket that something was wrong. The analgesic compound was gone. The particulate dispersal canister, the one I had used in the second bout, had been replaced with an empty unit. 3 of the synthesis compounds in the inner compartment were missing. Someone had taken enough to compromise me, and left enough to make it look like nothing had changed. I sat down on the bunk and looked at the kit for a while. Then I did what I always do when the equipment situation is worse than expected. I made an inventory of what I had. I looked at everything in the pen, the bunk, the storage locker, the emergency supply cabinet on the wall that was standard conclave issue for all competitor quarters. I looked at it all very carefully, the way you look at a crash site before you start treating casualties, cataloging everything available before you decide your approach. The emergency supply cabinet contained standard items, bandaging materials, a sealed ration pack, a chemical heat pack for temperature regulation, a compact atmospheric sensor rated for closed space environmental monitoring, a small bottle of cleaning solvent for equipment maintenance. I opened the atmospheric sensor and read the spec panel on its back. It monitored 17 different atmospheric compounds. It was not designed as a dispersal mechanism, but the housing was pressurized, and the solvent, which I recognized by its compound code, was a high-conductance fluid with a vapor rate that I knew very well because I had used a related compound in a sarin respiratory emergency on Kepler Station 2 years earlier. I was not going into the semi-final with a compromised kit. I was going in with a different kit, built from what I had. That was not a new situation. That was Tuesday. I spent 2 hours building what I needed. The semi-final opponent was the Sarin Swarm. I want to be precise about what the Sarin are, because the word swarm does not fully convey the reality. A Sarin combat unit is not a single organism. It is between 300 and 400 individual beings, each roughly the size of a human fist, operating under a shared pheromone communication network so efficient and so rapid that the unit functions, to all practical purposes, as a single mind distributed across hundreds of bodies. It cannot be fought the way a single organism can be fought. You cannot outmaneuver it, because it has no single position to outmaneuver. You cannot pressure a weak point, because its weak points are distributed and self-compensating. A third of a Sarin unit could be incapacitated, and the remaining units would simply redistribute the load without breaking function. To stop a Sarin unit, you did not attack it. You disrupted its communication. Sarin pheromone communication operated on specific molecular frequencies. Different signals for different commands. Move forward, hold position, converge, disperse. The signals were precise and the receptors were sensitive, because precision was what made the system work at the speed it worked. That sensitivity was also, if you knew the chemistry, a vulnerability. The Sarin word for it would have translated as signal confusion. My word for it was the name of the compound I had spent the past 2 hours synthesizing from the contents of the emergency supply cabinet and 3 items from my medkit that had not been taken. The bout started the way Sarin bouts always started. The unit flowed out of the competitor gate like dark water, spreading across the floor in a shifting, coordinated mass. The crowd in the upper tiers reacted to the visual of it, the way they always did, with that particular frequency of noise that I had come to associate with impressed unease. I walked to the center of the floor and stood still. The Sarin unit read my stillness as a tactic. It began its encirclement approach, looping out to the edges of the floor in a wide arc, designed to surround and compress from multiple directions simultaneously. The approach was calculated and effective. Against anything that operated on a single-point defensive logic, it worked perfectly. I waited until roughly 2/3 of the unit had completed the arc, and the surround was nearly established. Then I released the compound I had built into the arena's ventilation return. The low intake vent at the base of the east wall, directly behind my position, rated at a circulation volume that would distribute an airborne compound across the full floor area in approximately 90 seconds. The effect on the Sarin unit was not violent, it was precise. The compound did not incapacitate individual units. It introduced enough molecular interference into the pheromone communication layer that the shared signal, the single mind holding all those individual bodies together, became unreliable. The command still transmitted, but with error rates high enough that the unit began to respond to conflicting instructions. It took 40 seconds. A third of the unit moved to converge. A third held position. A third attempted to withdraw toward the gate. When parts of a Sarin unit move in 3 contradictory directions simultaneously, the conclave rules define it as a loss of combat coherence. A loss of combat coherence triggers automatic disqualification. The ruling came through in 90 seconds. I was in the final. In the corridor afterward, I found a full medkit waiting outside my pen, not core issue. Conclave standard, fully stocked, no note, no sender identification. I turned it over in my hands, checked the seals all intact, all original. Someone had gone to the effort of sourcing a replacement and leaving it without acknowledgement. I thought about Velsorn. I thought about the food packet from the unnamed crew member. I thought about the even medic and his analgesic gel. I thought about how many of them had started this conclave expecting to find one thing in a yellow tag and had found something else. I put the new medkit on the bunk and went to find Colin. I had a name on a personnel list and I had a semi-final victory, and those 2 things together meant it was time to stop being quiet about what I knew. Colin listened to everything. So did Laura. So did Peter Crane, who had been working through the toxicology data in the medical bay for 3 days straight. When I finished, Peter set down his stylus very carefully and said that the compound profile I had described was consistent with what he had been building toward in his own analysis. He had 2 candidate names from his end. One of them matched mine. The name was Dr. Oren. He was the Conclave's senior medical liaison for the cross-species health monitoring program. He had access to every competitor's biometric data. He had the chemical knowledge. He had a formal relationship with 3 of the species delegations that would lose treaty advantages if a human team won the conclave. He had also, according to Peter's cross-reference, countersigned the equipment inspection form that had approved my medkit for arena use, the same form that would have told someone exactly what was in it and what removing those specific items would do to my operational capability. He had not expected me to reach the final. He had made the calculation that a yellow tag going into the semi-final against a Saren unit, with a compromised kit, would be the end of it. He had been wrong, and now there were fewer than 18 hours until the final, and he was out of moves. Or so I thought. The final opponent was announced at midnight. The display in my holding pen updated while I was reviewing the new medkits. Contents. I looked at the screen. I read the entry twice. Then I set the kit down and sat very still for a moment. The Conclave's adjudication panel had convened an emergency session at 10 in the evening and had voted, by a margin of 7-5, to authorize a change to the final round format. They had introduced a new category of competitor, classified under the Conclave's Rule 44 Supplemental, which permitted the use of a Conclave-sanctioned enforcement construct in Arena, conditions for the purposes of ensuring the integrity of the competition, where disputes about human tactical methodology had been raised. The construct was called an Arbiter-class response unit. It was a machine. It was approximately 2 meters tall, built from the same reinforced alloy as the Arena gates. And it had been, according to the announcement, specifically calibrated in the past 72 hours using recordings from my previous 4 bouts. It had no nerves, no fatigue, no paralytic cooldown, no old injuries, no pressure points. It had sensor arrays calibrated to read biological movement, atmospheric changes, and thermal shifts. It had counter-response algorithms designed to recognize and neutralize the approach patterns I had demonstrated. Someone had built a machine to beat me. I read the announcement 3 more times. I turned it over in my mind the way I turn a difficult diagnosis over, looking at it from different angles, testing the weight of it. And then, quietly, something that had been sitting in the back of my thinking for the past 4 days came forward and settled into place. They had built a machine to beat me. Which meant they had been watching me with enough attention and enough concern that they had decided a machine was necessary. The species that had laughed at my yellow tag 3 days ago had spent 3 days building a machine to stop me. The people who had been completely certain I was not worth concern had convened an emergency session at 10 in the evening, voted by 7-5, and authorized an entirely unprecedented change to the Conclave's final round format. They were afraid. I had walked into this arena as something they did not take seriously. They had taken me so seriously that they had changed the rules. I looked at my yellow tag for a long time. Then I picked up the new medkit and started checking its contents again, this time with a completely different question in mind. Not what can I use against a biological opponent? What can I use against a machine? A machine is not a body. It does not have nerves or blood or the accumulated weaknesses of a life lived in a gravity well. But it is also not magic. It is engineering. It is systems and interfaces and inputs and outputs. It is the product of decisions made by someone in a limited amount of time, under pressure, which means it is the product of assumptions. And assumptions, in my experience, are the most reliable vulnerability that any system has. The Arbiter-class construct had been calibrated to counter what it had seen me do. That meant it had been calibrated around a specific and necessarily incomplete picture. It knew what I had done. It did not know what I had not yet done. I thought about that for a long time. Then I thought about the atmospheric sensor, still sitting on the shelf of the emergency supply cabinet. The one with the pressurized housing. The one that monitored 17 atmospheric compounds. I thought about open-circuit sensor arrays and what high-conductance aerosol compounds did to them. I thought about the Conclave's technical specification for the Arbiter-class unit, which had been included in the announcement. A formality of transparency that the people who had drafted the announcement had included without thinking much about it, because they had not imagined that the person reading it would be looking for something specific. In the specification, in a standard footnote about sensor maintenance, there was a line about the unit's counter-response system, requiring continuous uplink to the Conclave's central adjudication network for real-time tactical updates. Without the uplink, the system operated on cached data only. The cached data update interval was listed as 11 seconds. 11 seconds. I had been working with less. I set the medkit on the bunk, lay down, closed my eyes and spent 4 hours thinking through every detail of what I was going to do in the morning. Not sleeping, thinking. Planning the way you plan when the margin is thin and the cost of missing something is complete. At 4 in the morning I got up, made the final modifications to what I was bringing in, and sat down on the bunk with the new medkit in my lap and my yellow tag in my hand. The arena floor was going to be different in a few hours. Not a body, not a hunter, a machine, built by frightened people in 3 days, designed to end the thing that had frightened them. I had been a field medic for 9 years. I had worked in crash sites, in collapse zones, in radiation leak corridors and flooded biology labs, in the cargo bay of a failing transport ship in the outer belt. I had worked in conditions where the resources were wrong, where the environment was hostile, where everything that was supposed to help was broken or missing or never arrived. In all of those situations, there had been one question that had pulled me through every time. Not what do I need, not what is missing. The question was always simpler and always more powerful. How does this fail? Everything fails. Every system, every machine, every plan, every certainty. The entire practice of medicine is built on that understanding. You do not keep people alive by assuming they are fine. You keep them alive by knowing exactly how they could stop being fine and staying one step ahead of it. You find the failure mode. You block it. You move to the next one. The arbiter-class construct had been built to beat me. I was going to find how it failed. The final session began at dawn. The crowd was the largest it had been in 4 days. Every tier was full. On the display screens, the conclave announcement text still scrolled in 3 languages, describing the rule change and the construct's credentials. Above the adjudication tier, I could see the panel in their seats, and among them, I could see a figure that was not a panel member. A figure in the standard gray uniform of the Conclave Medical Liaison Corps, watching the floor with an expression I could read clearly at 50 meters. Dr. Oren was watching. I walked out onto the floor and did not look at him again. The arbiter-class construct was already positioned at the opposite end. It was everything the specification had described. Solid. Still, its sensor arrays were running. I could see the faint indicator lights cycling through their sweep pattern along the upper housing. It was tracking me from the moment I cleared the gate, logging my movement, my heat signature, my weight distribution, comparing it against cached recordings of every pattern I had demonstrated in the previous 4 bouts. I walked to the center of the floor. The construct did not wait. It moved the moment the bout signal sounded, and it moved with a mechanical precision that was different from anything I had faced before. Not the committed momentum of Roxanne, not the intelligent feigning of Velsorn. Pure calculated geometry. It read my position, projected my movement arc, and placed itself where the intersection of those 2 calculations said I would be. It was right. The first impact sent me sideways across the floor. Not dangerous. The construct was calibrated to incapacitate, not destroy, which meant there were limiters on its force output, but calibrated incapacitation from something that size was still enough to put me down if it landed the way it was supposed to. I rolled with the impact, came up moving, checked my distance. The construct recalculated and came again. I moved. It adjusted. I feinted. It saw through the feint because it had watched me feint 3 times in recorded bouts and knew my setup patterns. I tried a different angle. It was already there. I let it tag me twice more, each time absorbing and recovering. Not because I was losing, because I was counting. I was counting the seconds between the construct's tactical updates. Each adjustment it made, each recalculation, showed a tiny lag the uplink cycle, the moment of data refresh. The specification had said 11 seconds. The actual interval, watching its motion patterns, was closer to 9. Tighter than I had planned for. Not impossibly tight. I had 12 seconds of action if I chose the right moment. I needed the sensor arrays down. The atmospheric sensor housing was in my kit. The solvent vapor would reach the construct's open-circuit sensors in approximately 4 seconds if deployed at close range. The solvent would disable the external sensor array without affecting the mechanical systems. The construct would lose real-time data input and be forced to operate on its cached profile. The cached profile was 9 to 11 seconds old. 9 to 11 seconds in which it would be responding to a version of me that was slightly behind where I actually was. I set up the deployment on the 4th exchange, during a pass where the construct's angle placed me momentarily between it and the primary camera array. Not to hide from the cameras, but because that angle put the construct's sensor housing directly in front of me at a distance of roughly 1.5 meters. I deployed the solvent aerosol at point-blank range directly into the sensor array housing. The effect was not dramatic. The indicator lights along the upper housing flickered. The sweep pattern on the sensor array halted. The construct continued moving on its last catched data, which was 9 seconds old, which meant it was moving to a position I was no longer in. I was already at its right lateral joint. A machine has no nerves and no pressure points, it has joint tolerances. The arbiter-class specification had listed the rotational tolerance of the main lateral stabilizing joint at 87 degrees before structural override. I applied force at 91 degrees, using the mechanical advantage of my full body weight driven at the correct angle, in the space of the 9-second window. The structural override triggered. The construct went down. Its indicator lights cycled through a reset sequence. It was not destroyed. It was not permanently damaged. The structural override was a safety function built into the design, a failsafe to prevent joint rupture that defaulted to a lockdown stance and a system reboot. The reboot sequence, according to the specification footnote I had memorized, took a minimum of 30 seconds. I stood up. I stepped back from the construct. I looked at the adjudication panel. The panel was not moving. The arena was not making a sound. I looked at my yellow tag. Then I looked up at the section of the tier where Dr. Oren had been standing. He was still there, but he was no longer watching the floor. He was looking at the data slate in his hand, and even at that distance, I could see from the way he was holding it, very still, very tightly, that whatever was on the screen was something he had not been expecting to see. Peter Crane had filed the formal complaint to the Conclave Oversight Committee at 5 in the morning, timed to clear the administrative queue exactly as the final bout began, timed so that the committee's initial acknowledgement and the automatic data flag it triggered on every Conclave communication system would arrive at the precise moment when the complaint would be hardest to suppress quietly. The data flag was on Dr. Oren's slate because his medical liaison credentials were one of the access points cited in the complaint. The ruling from the adjudication panel came through. Incapacitation confirmed. Bout awarded to the human delegation. The Calveth Conclave was ours. The sounds that came from the crowd after that were varied and layered, and I could not categorize all of them. Some I recognized, some I did not. There were frequencies in there that I was fairly sure were not being produced by species I had encountered before, which meant either I had more research to do, or the acoustics in the arena were doing something unusual. I stood in the middle of the floor in the quiet center of all that noise, and I looked at the yellow tag clipped to my collar, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been moving around restlessly for the better part of 4 days. In the post-bout corridor, Velsorn was waiting outside the gate. He was not a member of any delegation that would have had access to the spectator sections, which meant he had been somewhere he was not technically supposed to be, which I decided not to mention. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he gave me a slow, deliberate nod, a movement that started at the top of his head and traveled down through his shoulders. I had spent 11 months alongside Keth Moran researchers at a field station in the Aaron system. I knew that gesture. It was the one they made when they encountered something they expected to be thinking about for a long time. I nodded back. In the official debrief, a senior conclave representative asked me to describe my strategic approach to the tournament. I told them the truth. I said I had not had a strategy. I had had a question. The same question I carry into every operating theater, every crash site, every field triage situation where the available resources are wrong and the situation is worse than it should be, and the only way forward is to start from what you have and think more carefully than the problem does. The representative asked what the question was. I said, "How does this fail?" The representative wrote that down. Then she looked at my yellow tag and said, carefully, that the Conclave's classification committee would be reviewing the non-combatant designation criteria in light of recent events. I told her that I appreciated the thought, but that I would prefer to keep the yellow tag as it was. She looked at me for a long moment. I told her that it had been doing very good work. The treaty realignment that Glenn had briefed us on in the first week began processing automatically through the Conclave's formal systems within hours of the bout ruling 6-star systems. 12 separate bilateral agreements, trade access, research rights, territorial boundary confirmations, all of them updating in real time, the legal language rewriting itself according to protocols that had been sitting dormant for 30 years, waiting for a human team to qualify as a trigger. Dr. Oren was placed under formal investigation before the end of the day. Peter Crane had prepared a complete evidential submission. The toxin profile, the access logs, the equipment inspection counter signature, the communication records linking Oren to 3 of the delegations with the most to lose. It was thorough. Peter was thorough. It was one of the things I had always admired about him. Glenn was awake by evening, not fully recovered but awake and alert, and, when Colin told him what had happened, wearing an expression that I would have paid money to preserve permanently. He looked at me for a very long time. Then he said, "You did it with a medkit," I said, "and some items from the emergency supply cabinet," he said. "You were classified as non-combatant," I said. "I still am." He said nothing for a moment. Then he laughed quietly and looked at the ceiling and shook his head. I went back to my pen and started writing up my xenoanatomy notes from the tournament. There was a great deal of material that I thought would be useful to the medical database. Several of my field observations, the Drath lateral nerve cluster, The VEC pressure response, the Keth-Moran recharge interval, the sarin pheromone interference frequencies did not appear in the current literature in the practical form that I had needed them. I intended to change that. The yellow tag sat on the desk beside my data slate. I looked at it occasionally as I wrote, not with sentimentality. Exactly. More with the feeling of looking at a tool that had done exactly what it was designed to do, though not in the way anyone had originally intended. Before I finished writing that night, I filed one administrative request with the Conclave's records office. I asked that my tournament classification be entered into the official record, unchanged, non-combatant, yellow tag fragile. The records officer who processed the request sent back a single-word acknowledgement. I saved it. It was the word they used for things that did not fit into existing categories. I had decided, definitively, to take that as a compliment. My medical license hangs above my desk at the core research station on Kel-Dor Prime. I was assigned there permanently 6 months after the conclave, at my own request. Good research library, good lab access, proximity to the conclave's medical archive. The yellow tag hangs beside it. People who visit the office ask me about the two of them sometimes. They ask which one I am prouder of. I tell them they are the same document. They usually need a moment with that. I find I do not mind waiting.